This desolate and derelict site was once the world's largest copper mine, Paris Mountain on Anglesey. Mining effectively ended here more than 100 years ago, but in its heyday, 1,200 men, women and children toiled to win copper from the ground. A visitor of the time recorded.
One of the overseers of the Paris mine accompanied us over the works. We first were conducted to some wooden stages, erected on the edge of the basin, if I may so employ the term, to an immense excavation of an oval form, about 200 yards long, half as much in width and 80 in depth, which had been hollowed out over the course of 20 years. These wooden stages are each supplied with a windlass for the purpose of drawing up the ore from the bottom. On looking down from hence to the chasm beneath, we saw the rock rich with ore, which the miners were busily employed in boring, blasting, breaking with sledgehammers, wheeling the fragments to the appointed places beneath the stages, filling the baskets, which were hauled up, as before mentioned, by the windlass. As soon as the commodity is landed, it is delivered to a number of women and children, to be broken into smaller pieces. The good ore is then separated from that of an inferior sort and carried to kilns to be baked. We understand that a better kind of ore would be sent to Neath and other places through the port of Amloch.
Amloch was very much the copper port. But no ore has passed through here this century. So Paris Mountain seems to be a mine of the past. It's a past that goes back a fair way, because the Romans probably mined copper here on a small scale, and the Phoenicians might have been here before them. This copper ingot, this copper cake, was found locally. It weighs something like 20 kilos, and it must have been a very valuable commodity, because copper was a very important metal to the Romans. But of course, its properties had been known and appreciated long before the Romans came on the scene. Copper's malleable and ductile. It's ideal for making into pots and pans and ornaments. It can be cast easily, and it's soft enough to be stamped, to make into coins. Now, of course, in the time of the Roman Empire, the demand for copper was comparatively high. But as the empire collapsed, so the demand for copper declined, and so did mining activity. And from about the 5th to the 16th centuries, probably not much more than a couple of 100 tons a year of copper was needed to keep the whole of Britain supplied with utensils and coinage. And then in the 17th century, demand was stimulated again by the military. Bronze cannons, and later the successful sheathing of warship hulls again made copper a vital strategic resource. So much so that the government feared they could no longer rely on imported metal. In 1564, they had relaxed the Crown monopolies on prospecting and mining, and this encouraged the search for local sources of metal. In 1768, the copper ores of Paris Mountain were rediscovered, and in a few years, this was the most productive copper mine in the world. And the reason, rich copper ores were available at the surface. You can see the multicolored copper sulfides. The grade of copper was as much as 10% or more in places, and the average was around 5%. Now, there are lots of exciting-looking veins in this rock, but actually they contain very little copper. These veins look geologically very interesting, but they're economically worthless. Now, as the miners followed the veins and lodes of rich ore underground, they encountered the miners' age-old enemy, water. And in order to deal with water, they needed pumps. With Paris on top of a mountain, the obvious power source for the pumps was the wind. And when that wasn't enough, giant steam engines were installed. The pumping was so successful that the miners were able literally to honeycomb Paris Mountain. In fact, they were almost too successful because their workings caved in. But that formed the basis of the open pits from which the ore was soon being raised again. What's more, there was another splendidly efficient way of getting copper out.
In walking round the premises, we crossed a small stream, running into some square reservoirs. This water was so impregnated with copper that merely the dipping of a key in it, for 2 or 3 seconds, rendered it entirely the colour of that metal. The square reservoirs above mentioned were stored with all the old iron that could be collected, which are turned monthly. The copper on them sinking in a kind of red slime to the bottom.
The scale of extraction of copper here was unprecedented for its time. But the lifetime of this mine as a major producer was only a few decades. Production passed its peak in the early 1800s, and by 1890, all the really easily worked ores were gone. It's ironic that this great mining enterprise died just as the demand for copper really began to take off. And that happened because as the Industrial Revolution developed through the 19th and into the 20th centuries, copper and its alloys provided more and more of the components for technologies that we now take for granted. Bushes, bearings, castings, pipes, they're all vital for engineered products. But one industry needed copper more than any other metal, the electrical industry. As well as all its other useful properties, copper is an excellent conductor. It's an ideal material for carrying electric current, from simple car wiring to power lines to telephone cables. And in fact, the biggest single use of copper in the last few decades has been in ordinary domestic wiring. So what's actually happened to the demand for copper since the Paris Mountain mines closed down at the end of the 19th century? The demand for copper has grown dramatically during the 20th century. Fluctuations in the overall upward trend of production reflect major events in recent world history. But those fluctuations haven't concealed the basic pattern. For most of the 20th century, copper production increased exponentially, with a doubling time of about 20 years. The production curve leveled off in the late 1970s and early 80s, but world mine production is still between 7 and 8 million tons of copper metal. Compare those several millions of tons with the 40,000 tons that were produced from Paris Mountain in its entire lifetime. Even though this hole may look big, the world would need a new Paris Mountain about every 2 days, and that assumes that rich copper ores are still available. At a grade of 5%, copper ores like this represent a concentration factor of something like 1,000 times over the concentration in ordinary average crustal rocks. But the sad fact is that rich ores like this are few and far between, and the accessible ones have been found and worked out long ago. Much commoner, though, are lower grade ores like this, with about 0.5% copper. Even that's still 100 times more concentrated than copper in average crust. These are very, very plentiful, but there was no way that ores like this could have been mined until late in the 19th, early 20th century, because what was needed was a technological breakthrough. The early 20th century saw the development of machinery to crush and grind ores on a large scale. New techniques were developed to separate ore from waste rock. Most important was froth flotation, which enabled very low-grade ores to be processed on a commercial scale. Copper ores with grades as low as about 0.5% became economic for the first time. This is a typical large-scale modern mine. To get a ton of copper, something like 200 tons of rock have to be dug out, crushed, and processed. And that needs more than just a pick and shovel. This electric shovel can lift about 40 tons in one scoop, more than a Paris Mountain miner could lift in a week. And on a good day, a mine like this can shift more than 100,000 tons of ore. Some modern mines are so big that it's worth processing and smelting the ores to metal on the site. The investment in integrated mines like this is measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. The lead time between initial investment and any financial return can be several years. Modern developments have allowed progressively lower grade ores to be seen as viable investments. So the graph of production on the one hand and the graph of grade on the other have moved in opposite directions. As production has risen, grade has fallen. Present-day copper mining is a classic example of the application of economies of scale. But giant copper mines like this aren't evenly distributed throughout the world. There's no regular pattern. Geology bears absolutely no relation to national boundaries. Copper's a good example of the uneven distribution of physical resources. Here are the major copper producers. Compare that with the consumers. Some countries produce far more than they consume. Others consume far more than they produce. When you total the world production of copper and compare it with world consumption, there appears to be a discrepancy. Consumption is greater than production. The reason is that the major consumers recycle copper on a big scale. And in some places, recycled copper can account for 40% of total consumption. In 4 countries, Peru and Chile in South America, and Zambia and Zaire in Africa, the production to consumption ratio is very high. Copper is a crucial export resource in these countries, which are members of CPEC, a producer cartel. They are neither rich nor industrialized, and they export virtually all of their copper to earn foreign exchange. Their burden of international debt grows heavier if the price of copper falls, and they are not in a good position to control that price. The price of copper and of several other metals is determined at the London Metal Exchange. Although there's some speculation and manipulation of prices here, ultimately the laws of supply and demand have to be obeyed. This is a supply-price curve. It shows that if the price increases, then a producer or manufacturer can turn out more of the product. Quantity increases. If the price falls, less can be produced. Quantity decreases. The effect of changes in the supply structure are depicted by changing the position of the curve. If the supply of a commodity increases, the curve moves to the right. If supply decreases, the curve moves to the left. This is a demand-price curve. If price rises, demand falls. Quantity goes down. If price falls, demand rises. Quantity goes up. If the demand structure changes, then the curve moves. If there's an increase in demand, the curve moves to the right. If there's a decrease, it moves to the left. When you put the two curves together, they intersect at the equilibrium price. In a time of recession, such as afflicted most of the world in the early 1980s, the demand for commodities falls. The demand curve shifts to the left. If the supply-price structure remains the same, then there's a new equilibrium price that's lower than the original. And in our case, because the costs of mining can't be reduced very much, this means that less copper can be produced at a profit. When that happens on a global scale and the recession is prolonged, the inevitable result must be that some mines will close. In countries where copper is a mainstay of the economy, like the CPEC nations, these effects can be drastic. And the CPEC nations are particularly exposed to another threat, arising out of the fact that technology doesn't stand still. The threat is technological substitution. For instance, a major use of copper in high-voltage transmission cables has been lost to a competitor, aluminium. The combination of technological development and market forces makes the CPEC nations economically very vulnerable. And that's in spite of the fact that between them they have about half of the world's copper reserves. Those reserves total some 350 million tons of copper metal equivalent. Those 350 million tons represent the amount of copper in ores which can be economically mined. They are ores containing copper at concentrations greater than cut-off grade, and the price-cost ratio is greater than 1. There are about another 350 million tons of conditional resources. These are copper ores which are known to exist, but are not presently worth mining for financial or political or even environmental reasons. Their price-cost ratio is less than 1. The number we put on them is a good deal less certain than that for reserves. This is the sensitive boundary. When times are good, the boundary moves down. Some of the hitherto conditional resources get reclassified as reserves, and they can be mined at a profit. When times turn bad, the boundary shifts up. Yesterday's profitable reserves become today's conditional resources, and that's when mines begin to close. Of course, the boundary can also be shifted down if some new technology makes lower-grade ores profitable to extract. But mainly, it's economic forces that control how it moves. This is a graph showing cumulative copper production against operating costs. A few large-scale mines are low-cost producers. The majority of the world's production comes from mid-cost producers. And there are a number of high-cost mines in countries where foreign currency earnings are more important than cost efficiency. The price decides which mines make a profit or a loss. When the price drops, fewer mines are in profit. So what decides the potential profitability of a new mine? Operating costs will be affected by a number of factors, and so will the price obtained for the ore leaving the mine. Only if the projected price-to-cost ratio is very high will a mine venture even be considered today. In the period 1968 to 1983, costs steadily increased. This broad band reflects the range of mine operating costs at any one time. But prices fluctuated widely. In 1969, virtually all mines made a profit. By 1973, a few were making a loss. And by 1983, the majority were losing money. This trend generally caused the mines with the highest operating costs to close. In general, production decreases at times of market slump. So price profoundly affects the boundary between reserves and conditional resources. It has much less effect on hypothetical resources. Hypothetical resources of copper could amount to 10 times the tonnage of conditional resources, but nobody knows for certain. The only way to find out is by exploration. A wide variety of geophysical and geochemical techniques is now available to the exploration geologist. The increasing use of remote sensing information from Earth-orbiting satellites enables exploration teams to pinpoint likely target areas within a particular region. The helicopter can get them quickly to where they want to go. But even when exploration is successful in discovering a large new deposit, that's just the start. When you turn a wilderness like this into a huge hole in the ground, there are political, social, and environmental issues to be considered, as well as the financial and technical feasibility. It can take hundreds of millions of dollars of investment and lead times of 10 to 15 years before any metal comes out of the mine. At each of the stages in this flow diagram, risk assessments involving economic, scientific, logistic, and other factors must be made. Only if the evaluation is favorable can the project go forward to the next stage. There's always the risk that at any point the project will be stopped, or at any rate deferred. Remote and less explored regions of the world aren't the only places in which to look for copper and other metals. Another favourite kind of area for mining companies is one with a long history of mining.
Among this throng of congregated dead, of kindred men whose spirits hence hath fled, here lieth one whose mind has longed to bear a toilsome task of industry and care. He first yon mountain's riches found, first drew its minerals blushing from the ground. He heard the miner's first exulting shout, then toiled near 50 years to guide its treasures out.
John Roos was credited with the discovery of Paris Mountain, but what he really did was to re-evaluate a known prospect. Since his time, the mine has closed and reopened a number of times. But after the end of the 19th century, operations were only on a small scale. The precipitation lagoons, or ponds, were used until the early 1950s. The spoil heaps have been reworked to extract the copper left behind in earlier, cruder treatments. Since the Second World War, uncertainties in many of the copper-producing countries have caused multinational mining companies to re-evaluate prospects in stable countries like Britain. Here in Anglesey, a succession of companies have held the exploration rights to Paris Mountain. This drill hole was put down during one of the re-evaluation programs, and this piece of drill core is from another of those holes. And this is what's really exciting. Paris Mountain was a copper mine because rich ore was accessible, easily worked, and easily processed. This is a much more complex ore. It's a mixture of zinc and copper and lead sulfides. The early miners knew about it, they called it bluestone, but to them it was virtually worthless because they hadn't got the technology to work it. And the various evaluation programs that have gone on since the late 60s up into the early 80s have established that on the north side of Paris Mountain, at about 500 meters down, there are several million tons of ore with a total combined metal grade of something like 12% of zinc and copper and lead in that order, with a fair bit of silver and gold by way of a bonus. And in 1984, a Canadian-based mining company acquired the property with the aim of sinking a deep shaft mine to work this deposit. And so another chapter in the long history of this single mine seems about to begin. But this time, it won't be as a copper mine, it'll be as a zinc mine, with a variety of other metals as byproducts and co-products. In the Western world, mining companies can only operate at a profit. When they're assessing the worth of a deposit, they have to take into account a whole host of factors, environmental, political, social, as well as economic. No matter what the complications are, they're all ultimately reduced to money terms, dollars per ton of ore. And if the grade is right, and the tonnage is right, and the market price is favourable in relation to the costs, then, and only then, will your mountain become a mine.